I'm Tom Murray. I'm one of the researchers at the Hastings Center, and I'm president of the center. One of the great benefits of working at the Hastings Center and being part of the extended community is that one gets to meet some really terrific people, including some world-class writers. And we're very grateful, I'm grateful, and we're fortunate to have tonight one of those people, Steve Hall. I can't recall when Steve and I first began talking, but it's been a long time. And Steve will write regularly for publications such as Scientific American, the Sunday New York Times Magazine, and other very credible sources. This is his 6th book, is that right? And just so you know what we're talking about, the book is Wisdom, From Philosophy to Neuroscience. So given that we're an ethics institute that works on ethics and science, this was like right in our sweet spot. So I knew that I'd want to be reading this book. Steve has talked to people really from a very wide spectrum in the sciences, including people who are doing such things as studying the neural activity in world-class meditators to see what goes on in the brain and can there be any correlation between that sort of activity and human experience. He's also begun to think about moral philosophy. So I'm going to read just one paragraph from the book, and it's the end of the chapter where he talks about morality. He says, so when it comes to moral judgment, maybe wisdom's role here is as a kind of elephant whisperer, rationing bits of reason in a way that soothes and nudges and perhaps even steers our inner pachyderm, allowing our best moral instincts to emerge. Confucius always understood that you could not have goodness without wisdom and courage. The emerging biology of moral choice challenges us to summon enough wisdom to discern when emotion distorts our moral judgment, and enough courage and strength to deflect the compass needle of the passions and point it toward loftier, larger, more meaningful goals. The sheer difficulty of that challenge may alone explain why so many of us find it so hard to be even a little wise. Now, Steve will speak for a bit. Should be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions and engage in a dialogue, after which we'll adjourn to the porch where we've set up a little reception, and we'll look forward to further conversation there. Steve has graciously agreed to sign books if any of you wish to purchase them after his talk, and they're on the table over there, along with a number of materials about the Hastings Center if you have curiosity about what the center's up to. Steve? Please welcome Steve.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction, Tom. It's always a pleasure to come to the Hastings Center. And on the drive up this afternoon, my daughter, who's first year high school student, asked me what bioethics was. And I tried to explain to her there was the process of kind of focusing on what are really important questions or dilemmas, figuring out how to think about them in a meaningful way so that it could guide our actions when we confront these particular dilemmas. And then I said this is quite a bit like wisdom, in fact. So the intersection here is quite appropriate. As Tom mentioned, I've been coming up here for a long time and talking to people at the Hastings Center, and it is a unique repository of wisdom in the sense that the people here have thought very hard and deep about some very important problems that many of us don't really think or are aware are coming up on the horizon, but they've done the hard work of kind of looking into the future and seeing these issues and problems. And, I kind of count on them and have counted on them in this project and in others for their thoughtfulness and their vision and their ability to kind of identify what is the truly important things that are coming up. And as you'll hear in a few moments, understanding or knowing what's important is a really important component of wisdom. So wisdom is obviously an immense topic, and it's difficult to talk about because so many people have so many different ideas about what actually it means. And I can imagine several pertinent questions running through your minds if this audience is typical of many of the other ones that I've spoken with. One of the questions is, what exactly does he mean by wisdom, and who the heck is this guy to be telling us about it? Those are both very good questions. I'm going to tackle the second one first because it's a little bit easier to answer, and also because it's a way of explaining how I got involved in this project and decided to write about this. I'm obviously not a philosopher. Lord knows I'm not a theologian, and so does my high school freshman English teacher, because I was the only kid in the class who flunked the Bible section in high school English. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm obviously not a neuroscientist. I am a science writer, and I've mostly written about pretty serious nuts and bolts science in the course of my career, so things like genetics and molecular biology, immunology, the history of these fields, sort of the intellectual development of them, what made them significant, and how things happened there. So that begs the question, what possibly moved me to think that I should be writing about wisdom, or a topic which is much fuzzier, obviously, than molecular biology or genes, or so it seemed at the time. And the story kind of begins with a phone call. Toward the end of 2006, I got a call from my editor at the New York Times Magazine, a woman named Vera Titunik, who explained that the magazine was working on a special issue about the baby boomer generation growing old, and would I be interested in contributing an article to the issue. I had done my first story for the New York Times Magazine in 1981, so I've had a very long relationship with the magazine, been writing more or less continuously for about 30 years for them. So I'm always delighted when they call up and ask me if I'd be interested in doing something. So I said, sure, what did you have in mind? And Vera said that they had heard that there had been some serious research scientific research done on wisdom. And I can tell you what I didn't tell her, which is that my heart sank as soon as I heard this, because I thought this is going to go nowhere, and I was looking forward to doing an article for the magazine, and this probably wasn't going to be the one. What I didn't tell her then is that it was my initial reaction, and it may be your initial reaction to this whole idea of the interaction of wisdom and science, which is that any kind of notion of serious research into wisdom was, to my mind, kind of ridiculous and contemptible. Again, as I said, I've spent my whole career writing about hard science, and also the critical thinking that produces hard science. And you'd be hard-pressed to come up with a fuzzier topic, a more difficult topic to define, much less research, than wisdom. So I didn't think this had a lot of promise. The notion that something as nebulous as wisdom could be studied scientifically or empirically seemed preposterous to me. Thank goodness I didn't say that to Vera. I said I would look into it, and she mentioned a couple people who had been doing research, and she would send me some background material on a couple psychologists who had done some of this work. I sort of responded, that's interesting, and because it was a phone conversation, she didn't see me rolling my eyes as I said, that's interesting, because I still didn't think this was going to go anywhere, but I said I would agree to read the research and do a little bit of background on it. So it turns out that there was a small group of psychologists in the 1970s and 1980s who had been inspired by the great psychologist Erik Erikson to investigate and begin a formal study of wisdom from the psychological point of view. And Erikson, interestingly, although he did not do any kind of formal study of wisdom, he actually mentioned wisdom in a chart that he prepared for a White House conference on childhood development in about 1950. And that was kind of the first invocation of wisdom in the psychological literature, even though it was just mentioned in a graph. And interestingly, from Erikson's perspective, wisdom was part of the what he called the 8th stage of life, is toward the end of one's life, and he described it as a point where one achieved ego integrity in the face of looming mortality. That is, that one was able to continue to function and be a productive human being in the face of mortality or approaching mortality. Which is actually a very interesting insight, because one of the things that's really fascinating about wisdom are these kind of cognitive conflicts or these contradictions or these paradoxes that we need to make sense of when there are two ideas in opposition and we both understand that they are important and yet they're in contradiction. But Erikson really didn't push this idea, and it just sort of sat around in the psychological literature. And then in the 1970s, the real impetus to study wisdom grew out of a field of psychology known, it grew out of gerontology, first of all, because the preceding decades in gerontological research and gerontological psychology had really focused on sort of physical declines with age, mental declines with age, cognitive declines with age. It was kind of a one-way street, and it was very negative in terms of what the process of aging was, that there really was nothing beneficial about it. In around 1975, several psychologists said, were kind of resisting this trend and say, why don't we look for some things that are kind of positive about aging? And one of the things they decided to look at was wisdom, with the thought that this would be a quality that would improve over the course of one's lifetime, and that this perhaps would be a benefit that would be one would accrue over the course of one's lifetime. So as I was reading this stuff, I realized that the people who were pursuing this actually were pretty significant psychological researchers, and I think they probably had to be to tackle, again, this fuzzy subject called wisdom. But there were people at Yale, at the University of Southern California, and at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Germany. And many of them grew out of a specialty within the field of psychology known as lifespan development, which is a very interesting form of psychology which not only talks about the inner psychological, emotional life of individuals, but also the times in which they live, the events through which they have lived through, the cumulative knowledge and experiences they've had because of their historical epic. So it's not just the individual, but rather it's the individual in the context of a society and history and how they develop. So they began to design some of these studies of wisdom and began publishing research. I think the first actual, even faintly empirical bit of research about wisdom came out in 1975 by a woman named Vivian Clayton, who was a postdoctoral candidate at USC, working for a pretty well-known gerontological psychologist named James Beeren. By 1990, this area of research had progressed to the point that there was an academic volume that came out. Robert Sternberg, who was a very well-known psychologist, who until recently was at Tufts University, edited an academic volume called Wisdom. And so I got my hands on this in the preparation for this story, and I started reading it. Now, I was still extremely skeptical, but a funny thing happened in the process of doing my background research. I just found myself fascinated with the topic of wisdom. Most of the research I read and write about involves gene regulation and transcription factors and molecular nuts and bolts of the immune response, very, very high-tech, focused and definitive types of empirical research. Suddenly, I was reading about life choices, moral judgment, emotional resilience, and resolving problems that often involved conflict between the needs of the individual and the needs of a larger group. I found the reading incredibly stimulating because it did what all of us writers hope that our work will do. It made me stop and think. And I think the stopping is as important as the thinking when you reach those moments. And then I began to notice several significant changes in the pattern of my own thinking and behavior as I began to do this homework. One was that whenever I read about wisdom and its definition, I found myself thinking about my own life and my own decisions. The definition of wisdom almost didn't matter. As Sternberg once said, To understand wisdom fully and correctly probably requires more wisdom than any of us have. But thinking about wisdom, what it is, how it might have a role in the day-to-day decisions and conflicts of our lives, is a wonderful exercise in what might be thought of as armchair mindfulness. So as I read these things, I just was thinking about my life, and I realized that I was kind of enriching my thought process on a daily basis by just pausing to do this. And I found that's why I call it armchair mindfulness, because it was never so focused as a disciplined activity, but nonetheless it was a repetitive activity that I found myself doing, and I found it very interesting and useful. In the course of doing the story for the Times, I then identified or found a group at Stanford University, actually, that had been doing some very nice longitudinal studies about how people process emotion at different stages in their life. And they've been following the same group of people for now almost 20 years. The bottom line, I talk about it in the book, but the bottom line of the research was that older people appear to process emotion in a different way than younger people do. And when I say process emotion, I basically mean how quickly do you reset from an adverse event, something that's negative, something that challenges you. They did behavioral studies that seem to suggest that younger people, in a very rough neurological sense, hang on to negativity a little bit longer than older people, that older people were able to rebound, were more resilient, had a greater coping ability. And then they added a component of brain scanning experiments to this, so they actually could see some difference in activities in parts of the brain that involve emotional reaction. So there was a more empirical feel to it that made me feel a little bit comfortable. I could talk about it in the article. Now, the problem was that wisdom is almost impossible to define. The book I just mentioned, the one that was edited by Robert Sternberg, had 13 chapters written by 13 different groups of psychologists, and each chapter offered a different definition of wisdom. So that's the definitional problem. But what I started doing was looking at what I saw were as concurrences between various definitions. What were the things that people kept coming back to again and again? And there were certain cognitive qualities and emotional traits that kept cropping up in the psychological literature. Things like being even-keeled emotionally, an ability to frame problems in a way that allows you to see alternative solutions, an ability to understand the viewpoint of others, an ability to weigh future rewards to balance the allure of immediate gratifications, a sense of moral and social justice, an ability to deal with limitation, uncertainty, and change. And this kind of led me to a secondary insight, which is that I knew that no one in neuroscience was doing any kind of serious research on wisdom. But I realized that a lot of cutting-edge neuroscientific research was being done on precisely these cognitive and emotional traits that the psychologists and, to be honest, the philosophers and theologians before them had identified as being central qualities related to wisdom. And if I had to bring anything special to this whole enterprise, I think it's the dumb luck of being, as a journalist, being superficial enough that we don't know any field very deeply, but we sometimes have a vantage point to see a number of fields and what's going on in them. The people in those fields actually are not aware, don't have that bigger picture. And the researchers don't talk to each other from different fields, but I could see things going on in both psychology and the philosophical tradition and neuroscientists doing things that they weren't talking to each other, but I could see the connections that they perhaps were not aware of. I knew that the neuroscientists were not familiar with the psychological literature on wisdom, but I was also aware, and this really struck me, that in the last 2 or 3 years, in very prestigious journals like Science, Nature Neuroscience, there were reports being published, and as some of you know, at the end of a scientific article, there are citations, and those kind of identify people who have worked previously on the question, whatever it is that you're doing research on. And I started seeing names like Aristotle, Plato, John Stuart Mills, John Rawls, Spinoza. So there was this interaction between philosophy and neuroscience was beginning to address these very old philosophical dilemmas and questions. And this was only happening in the last 2 or 3 years. So something was going on that was of interest. So I began to ask some questions. Can the workings of the brain help us understand what it means to be wise and perhaps suggest ways that we can become wiser? And really, is there any place for wisdom in the modern world that we all inhabit now with all the obvious distractions and tools and technologies and so on? And of course, before answering those questions, I had to have at least a tentative answer to another question, which is, what exactly is wisdom? So I'm not going to answer that question too specifically right now, because in part it's a question with so many dimensions that it's, again, difficult to have a very succinct definition, in part because the book is kind of a working progress of redefining the issue, mentioning definitions, arguing with them, and so on, and I don't want to go through that whole process, but I will mention two things that I found, two very short kind of summations that I found very useful. One of them was the famous Potter Stewart remark about pornography, actually. Potter Stewart, who was the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, said of pornography, "I can't define it, but I know it when I see it." And I think there's something about wisdom that's also like that. We're very hard-pressed to define it, but in our personal experience, we recognize an act of wisdom, a wise comment, perhaps a life lived in wisdom when we see it. So that was one thing that I thought was it suggested that we all have a working definition of wisdom in our minds, even though we maybe have difficulty delineating it. And then the other thing is a very succinct comment by Robert Nozick, who's a contemporary philosopher at Harvard, who wrote, "Wisdom is an understanding of what is important." Now, there's a lot of things that go into the process of figuring out what is important and then how that informs action. And some of those are neurological, I would argue. But it's a really interesting way to think about, if you had to boil it down and distill it to a very simple thing, what is important? And I think what makes wisdom a very difficult topic and a fuzzy one is that what is important today may not be important tomorrow, and what was important yesterday may not be important today. It's very contextual. It really depends on what's going on in the sort of broader, the broader events of life, and some things change, and being able to recognize those changes and respond to them is a really important component of knowing what's important. And that led me to an episode in my own life with which I begin the book, because it occurred to me much after the fact, I should add, that it was an exercise in deciding what was important. So I'm going to read a couple of fairly brief excerpts from the book just to give you a flavor of what it's like, but also some of the discussion. So, on a beautiful fall morning nearly a decade ago, like hundreds of mornings before and since, I dropped off one of my children at school. Michaela, then 5 years old, had just started first grade, and the playground chatter among both the children and their parents reflected that mix of nervous unfamiliarity and comforting reconnection that marks the beginning of the school year. I lingered in the schoolyard until Michaela lined up with her teacher and classmates. She wore a pretty purple dress that my mother had just sent her, white socks, and pink and white checkered sneakers. A hairband exposed her hopeful, eager, beautiful face. I sneaked in a last hug, as impulsive dads are wont to do, before she disappeared into the building. The time was about 8:40 a.m. As I left the schoolyard and began to head toward the subway and home to Brooklyn, I heard a thunderous, unfamiliar roar overhead. As the noise grew louder and closer, I froze in an instinctive crouch, much like the rats we always read about in scientific experiments on fear, wondering where the sound was coming from, knowing only that it was ominously out of the ordinary. Moments later, a huge shadow with metal wings passed directly over my head, like some prehistoric bird of prey. I instantly recognized it as a large, twin-engine commercial airliner. but nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened next. I watched for the endless 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds it took for this shiny man-made bird to fly directly into the tall building that I faced several blocks away. In real time, I watched a 395,000-pound airplane simply disappear. Almost immediately, black smoke began to curl out of the cruel, grinning incision its wings had sliced in the facade of the skyscraper. In moments when life's regular playbook flies out the window, when the ground shifts beneath our feet in a literal or figurative earthquake, we feel a surge of adrenalized fear at the shock of the unexpected. But right behind that feeling comes the struggle to make sense of the seemingly senseless, to try to understand what has just happened and what it means so that we will know how to think about a future that suddenly seems uncertain and unpredictable. In truth, the future is always unpredictable, which is why these moments of shock remind us with unusual urgency that we have a constant, if often unconscious, need for wisdom too. Although we now all know exactly what happened that terrible morning, the ground truth in Lower Manhattan on September 11, 2001 was much fuzzier at 8:45 a.m. One of the hallmarks of wisdom, what distinguishes it so sharply from mere intelligence, is the ability to exercise good judgment in the face of imperfect knowledge. In short, do the right thing, ethically, socially, familiarly, personally. Sometimes, as on this day, we have to deliberate these decisions in the midst of an absolutely roaring neural stew of conscious and unconscious urgings. In one sense, I knew exactly what had happened long before the first news bulletin hit the airwaves. In a larger sense, someone watching television in Timbuktu soon knew vastly more about the big picture than I did. This may be an exaggerated example, but it is in precisely the murk of this kind of confusion that we often have to make decisions. So what did I do? I went to a nearby shop and I bought a cup of coffee. It didn't occur to me until much later that this was a decision of sorts, perhaps a foolish one and certainly not an obvious one. But to the extent that I mustered even a dram of wisdom that day, it was in how I viewed the situation and what I thought was most important. Oddly, I felt little or no physical threat despite such close proximity to the unfolding disaster. In some respects, the event played much scarier on TV than in person. My immediate focus, even then, was on the long-term psychological impact that such a calamity might have on a young child, meaning my daughter, and what, if anything, a parent might do to minimize it. I hadn't quite understood yet that that would be my mission for the day, but by standing in the street and sipping a cup of coffee in that mysterious shorthand of human choice, I had chosen to stay close to my daughter, to stay calm, and failing that, to fake parental calm realistically enough to convince her that this was a situation we could deal with. But she didn't need to see the whole movie. I did not think it was a good idea for a young child to witness, as I did, human bodies falling like paperweight angels from the upper floors of the nearby tower. Even more, I did not think it was a good idea for a young child to absorb, even for a moment, the panic and despair written on the faces of all the adults who were beginning to comprehend that the world, as they had known it, even a few minutes earlier, had suddenly changed, slipping irrevocably out of their, however illusionary, controlling grasp. If you're thinking that I'm offering a smug little narrative about wise parenting, not to worry. Wisdom doesn't come easily to us mortals, and I've been reminded many times since that it probably didn't come to me that day either. Many of the choices I made that morning were second-guessed by my wife, by my friends, and even by my daughter. More to the point, my small-minded plan to buffer Michaela's emotional experience was rudely interrupted by the collapse of 500,000 tons of metal, concrete, and glass. Just as teachers began to evacuate children from the school, the second tower came down, unleashing the kind of apocalyptic roar no child should ever have to hear. And a huge pyroclastic cloud of debris came boiling up Greenwich Street toward us. You couldn't tell if the cloud was going to reach us or not, but it wasn't a moment for contemplation. I picked up Michaela and we joined a horde of people running up the street. As I carried her in my arms, swimming upriver in a school of panicked fish, She was forced to look backward, downtown, right into the onrushing menace of our suddenly dark times. Even to this day, however, the thing Michaela remembers most about the evacuation is the moment her classmate Liam accidentally walked into a street sign when he wasn't looking. It will be a long time, if ever, before I know if I acted wisely on 9/11. Indeed, it didn't even occur to me until I was writing this passage that the most important decision I made that day did not even rise to the level of conscious choice. I decided, without any conspicuous deliberation, that I had to be a parent first, not a journalist on that particular morning. At one level, it was an obvious choice. At another, it went against self-interest, career, my professional identity, taking advantage of being an eyewitness to the biggest story of my lifetime. What was I thinking? That, in a sense, is what I want this book to be about. How do we make complex, complicated decisions and life choices, and what makes some of these choices so clearly wise that we all intuitively recognize them as a moment, however brief, of human wisdom? What goes on in our heads when we're struggling to be patient and prudent, and are there ways to enhance those qualities? When we're being foolish, on the other hand, do our brains make us do it? And how does the passage of time and our approaching mortality change our thought processes and perhaps make us more amenable to wisdom? In moments of exceptional challenge and uncertainty, we tend to ask, how did this happen? What could we have done to prevent this dire turn of events? This is another way of saying, I realize now, that we are always searching for wisdom, but all too often we are looking for it in the rearview mirror, sifting the past for clues to how we might have thought about the future in a different way. We crave wisdom, we worship it in others, wish it upon our children, and seek it ourselves, precisely because it will help us lead a meaningful life as we count our days, because we hope it will guide our actions as we step cautiously into that always uncertain future. At times of challenge and uncertainty, nothing seems more important than wisdom. Economic wisdom, moral wisdom, political wisdom, even that private, behind closed doors wisdom that allows us to convey the gravity of changed circumstances to our children without making them afraid of change itself. Nothing seems more important, yet nothing seems more beyond our grasp until we begin to think about wisdom before we think we need it. So this is an interesting process to me. Even though we're unconscious of the process, I think we're always struggling in our choices and our decisions to obviously do the right thing, to do the wise thing. But I was curious about what's going on inside our brains when we're wrestling with these dilemmas, and is there any reason to think we might possibly become wiser if we understand the neural underpinnings of wisdom, or at least parts of this process? So I set out to see if I could attach any serious science to, if not wisdom itself, qualities or traits that seemed important to the idea of wisdom. Now, as many of you probably know, the power of modern science lies in reductionism. And this is the notion of taking a big biological idea like heredity or inheritance and reducing it to its component parts like genes so that experiments are easier to conduct and you can understand the process better and the mechanics of the process. In a more metaphoric sense, I took the same approach with wisdom. The idea itself is huge and defies easy description. But are there some common elements in the definitions of wisdom that might be reducible? And is there any real science that could be attached to those elements? I should say that when I started out doing this, I was hard-pressed to find a single scientist who would say she or he was studying wisdom, and for very good reason. People wouldn't think you were a very good scientist if you attempted to measure a process you couldn't even define. Excuse me. But when you break wisdom down into some of its component parts, when you reduce it, which I did by following the lead of the psychologists, I realized there was a lot of interesting research. And I organized this research somewhat arbitrarily into what I call 8 neural pillars of wisdom. And here's how I began to think about them as I moved. I should say that I did this magazine article. In our business, it's a kind of known danger and liability to try to balloon a magazine article into a book. Often there are a lot of books that should have stayed magazine articles, frankly, so if you're going to do a book about a topic, or if I'm going to do a book about a topic, I want there to be value added from what I did in the magazine article. I have be more meat on the bone, as it were. And so I had to convince myself, if I was going to do a book about this, that there was more to it than just what I had covered in psychologically in the Times article. So that's why I was looking for these examples of areas that there might be neuroscience that I could talk about that would be kind of interesting. So what were these 8 neural pillars of wisdom? One of them, as I mentioned before, is emotion regulation. And this has to do, when I say emotional regulation, this is how we process, again, adversity, difficult events. Coping and resilience are another way of saying how we respond to uncertainty or change in those circumstances and kind of reset our emotional barometer. Everyone, I think, gets flustered, and I think cool as a cucumber is not always as prevalent as some people think. But people do reset. Some people reset quicker than other people. Decision-making. But beyond just decision-making, about which there's been a lot of science, but what goes into attaching value to things so that when we finally make that decision, how do we translate what we emotionally feel is important into a neural value that makes a choice possible and apparent? Compassion, by which is meant not just a fellow feeling for another human being, but rather being able to imagine what another person's thought processes might be in order to interact with them, solve problems with them, understand where they're coming from. Moral reasoning about how we confront a moral dilemma and what kinds of processes go on that determine what we decide and reach a judgment and then action about it. Patience, which is, in my own personal example, I think is one of the key components of wisdom, and it often has to do with both delaying gratification in order to achieve a better and bigger goal later on, but also has to do with putting one's own ego needs at the side to attend to something else that's more important, and patience is part of that process. Humility, about which, frankly, there's less scientific empirical research than almost all these other things that I'm mentioning, but it's a really interesting quality that both philosophers and psychologists have repeatedly identified, in part because it reflects an openness to continually acquiring new knowledge and continually learning. So there is embedded in humility the idea that I don't know everything and that there's still some things I can learn and can find out about. Altruism, which is a really important element in any kind of communal setting where one's kind of tempers one's own immediate gratifications for something that will benefit or even make sacrifices in order to benefit the group at large, whatever that group may be. It often is a family, but it can also be a church congregation, an organization, whatever the grouping is. And the ability to cope with uncertainty and change is a really critical thing to think about in terms of wisdom because, and also the brain, because I think the human brain is, in all the organs created in nature, it is the one that is the most attuned to adaptation and change, because in order to survive, you have to recognize an uncertain or different situation, adapt to it, and find a different solution. And clearly, I think the success of our species in part is explained by our ability to respond to change, to unpredictability, cataclysm, and be able to find a solution and move forward and survive despite the being thrown by those things. And that, again, gets back to this sort of idea of being emotionally even-keeled. I hope you can see that each one of these traits is not an island virtue unto itself, but rather that they feed into and resonate with each other and kind of form a network of kind of fortifying traits that help us respond to life situations. Being emotionally even-keeled affects the kind of decisions you make, and compassion is not merely feeling for someone else, but somehow inhabiting and understanding their point of view, as I mentioned, which in turn informs our decisions and how we deal with them. So I set out to see if I could find any interesting brain science attached to these components of wisdom, and to see if the researchers were willing to talk about wisdom, which surprisingly many of them were. And I'll just give you one of many examples that are in the book, but just to give you a sense of the kind of work that's going on and the research that's currently undergoing, none of which under the rubric of wisdom for the most part, but nonetheless I think actually help our understanding of this process. One of the most fundamental cornerstones of wisdom has been compassion. It is a central concept in Confucianism, Buddhism, and Judeo-Christianity. The particle physicist Victor Weisskopf once said, "Knowledge without compassion is inhuman. Compassion without knowledge is ineffective." That's an epigrammatic intersection of compassion and science, but there is also a real intersection of compassion and brain science. For more than a decade, Richard Davidson, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin, has been flying in Buddhist monks to Madison to do brain experiments. He measures electrical activity in the brain while they meditate or lie in an MRI machine. Mathieu Ricard is a French-born Buddhist monk who has participated in a half dozen of these experiments on compassion, and I'd like to describe a bit of his visit on one of these sessions. So, at exactly 8:48 a.m. on an unseasonably brisk, overcast June morning in Madison with a hint of rain in the air, Mathieu Ricard climbed out of a Subaru Outback station wagon driven by his friend Richard J. Davidson, license plate, emote, adjusted his saffron and purple robes over bare arms, and then sauntered into the Waisman Center of Neuroscience for an arduous day of meditation. Over the previous few days, Ricard, a French-born Buddhist monk who lives in a monastery in Kathmandu, had flown from New Delhi to Newark, led a meditation workshop for financiers from a Manhattan stock brokerage firm at the Harvard Club, discussed a new book project, and then traveled to Wisconsin, where he has participated in experiments since 2000. As he walked down a long corridor, he paused to hug old friends. He has come to Madison half a dozen times for these experiments, and greet people he'd never met before, including a bemused maintenance worker holding a paintbrush. Within a few minutes, he had slipped out of his topsiders and settled his 62-year-old frame onto a green pillow on the floor of a small, dark, nominally soundproofed chamber. Then scientists attached a hairnet of 128 electroencephalograph, or EEG, electrodes to his shaven skull. Each electrode would measure electrical activity in this Buddhist brain as it meditated, capturing any changes in milliseconds, while nearby computer monitors would provide a running display of the readings. Neuroscientists prefer EEG to MRI brain scans in certain experiments because the technique captures instantaneous changes much better. "C'est bien, Mathieu?" asked Antoine Lutz, the French-born scientist leading the experiment. "Okay," Ricard replied. And with that, the heavy door was closed and the experiment began. "We have found a correlation between a deep state of meditation and changes in EEG activity of the brain," explained Lutz, who published his first monk data in a 2004 article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a leading international journal. That study reported that expert meditators who generated a state of, quote, unconditional loving kindness and compassion, and I'll just pause to say, you don't run across a phrase like that in the scientific literature very often. Unconditional loving kindness and compassion is, you would never have seen that even 5 years ago. Anyway, this produced accompanying changes in the brain, especially something called gamma band oscillations, about which more in a moment. Now they are gathering more data and asking expert meditators like Ricard to estimate the intensity of their mental states on a scale from 1 to 9 as their brain waves are being recorded. Nearly an hour into the experiment, after segments devoted to focused attention and open presence meditation, the voice of researcher Andy Francis was piped into the little room. "The next one will be compassion," he said. According to the experimental plan, Ricard would spend the first minute in neutral, not meditating, to provide a baseline of brain activity. After a pause of exactly 60 seconds, Francis leaned toward his microphone and said in a flat, neutral voice, "Compassion, compassion." At a scientific seminar in New York several months earlier, Richie Davidson had made the point that expert meditators could turn it on like that, which he indicated by snapping his fingers. And although Ricard's compassion meditation was not as instantaneous as snap fingers, it would probably strike most people as impressively quick. After 15 seconds, he rated his meditative state at 2. By 30 seconds, he was up to 3. By 39 seconds, he was up to 4. He reached 5 at the 1-minute mark and achieved a lofty 7 at 2 minutes. These are self-reported ratings, of course, and deserving of every bit of skepticism that self-reports inevitably invite. But since dedicating his life to the practice of Buddhism in 1972, literally the day after he received a PhD in molecular biology in the Paris laboratory of Nobel laureate François Jacob, Ricard has logged well over 10,000 hours of meditation. And I couldn't avoid the sense that I was watching a powerful neural engine rev up, roar, and accelerate like a race car, cognitively going from 0 to 60 in the figurative snap of a finger. As Ricard's meditative state deepened, the EEG readings scrawling across Andy Francis's computer screen visibly changed. At the beginning, they had been a series of thin, disorganized lines, the electrophysiological equivalent of lank, unkempt hair. By the time Ricard reached a self-assessed 8, about 7 minutes into his compassion meditation, the EEG readings had an intensity of amplitude, looking like bushy eyebrows, and an overall coherence and synchronicity that were apparent even to my novice eye. With a few practitioners, Francis confirmed, you can see the change in the raw data in real time when you say meditate, but that's very rare. At the risk of sounding credulous, if not downright corny, the electrical activity measured by dozens of electrodes plastered all over Ricard's noggin seemed in remarkable harmony. Then the muffled sound of a toilet flushing in a nearby bathroom could be heard, and whether this perturbed Ricard's meditative state or not, his subjective ratings began to drop. Later, in his office, Davidson agreed that the coherence and synchrony of these brainwaves was so striking that it was obvious even to non-experts. It doesn't require any fancy computer interpretation, he said. You can actually see it with the naked eye. It's so pronounced. His current thinking, pure conjecture at this point, he conceded, is that the pattern of brain activity observed during meditation, known as a gamma oscillation, might be a way for monks to coordinate activity in multiple parts of the brain while experiencing intense compassion. What is striking about the gamma, Davidson said, is the synchrony across brain regions that we see. From their own description, it's kind of a panoramic awareness that's fused with compassion. But the elements of the panoramic awareness suggest that there are many different systems in the brain that become functionally integrated, which may be a neural correlate of this experience of a panoramic or vast awareness. A study by the Wisconsin group, published in 2008 in the journal Public Library of Science 1, reported that fMRI studies of monks and also novices who followed a 2-week program of compassion meditation written by Ricard showed increased activity during compassion meditation in several distinct parts of the brain. In particular, sounds of distress roused activity in the insula and the anterior cingulate. Ricard emerged from the chamber in Madison looking fresh and energetic after the morning's experiments. You have to come to a lab to do meditation these days, he said with a chuckle, wiping his face with a towel. I'm not going to read it, but a couple pages later, they've actually been working out a circuitry that they think is involved in compassion. And as I understand the Buddhist concept of compassion, it's not simply feeling another person's pain and somehow incorporating that or somaticizing that in your own body so that you feel it yourself, but using that pain to motivate action. And the 3 parts of the brain that seem to be involved, that they've seen heightened activity in the MRI studies, involve this perception or sensitivity to other people, a kind of somatic rendering inside one's own body, and then a locus of activity that is an action center in the brain. So it's interesting that, this is very early in the game, but this translation of what the kind of traditional Buddhist explanation of compassion to activity in the brains of these expert practitioners, people who do this all the time, seems to have heightened activities in these 3 components of the brain. I talk about it in the book. So in any event, each of the middle chapters of the book revolves around one or another of these neural properties associated with wisdom. And just to summarize very briefly, on the basis of work that's gone on in the last 5 to 10 years, there's a neuroscience of moral judgment, there's a neuroscience of emotion regulation, there's a neuroscience of altruism, which has become a very hot field. There's a neuroscience of decision-making, including decisions in the face of uncertainty. And there's a neuroscience of delayed gratification. Some of these are animal experiments and obviously taken with a grain of salt that they're in mice and not in humans. But nonetheless, there's a lot of detailed biological investigation of these things that we associate with wisdom. And kind of to cut to the chase, when I started out pursuing this kind of hypothesis, there was no neuroscience of wisdom as far as I could tell. Interestingly, 1 month after I turned in the final draft of the book to my publisher, there was an article that appeared in the Journal Archives of General Psychiatry, which is a journal published by the American Medical Association, entitled A Neurobiology of Wisdom. It was a review article, and it cited the research of many of the people whose work I talk about in the book. I hasten to say that doesn't mean there is a neurobiology of wisdom, but it does mean that there's a conversation about it now that was not even a conversation 5 years ago. So it's something that people are talking about in a different way now. And even more recently, there was a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, I think just a couple of months ago, about wisdom and social cognition and differences in different age groups from young, middle-aged, and older people and how they perceived a problem. What I found even more interesting than the study itself was the fact that it was funded both by the National Institutes of Aging and the National Science Foundation, the NSF, and particularly the NSF, I think, is a tough granting agency. So the fact that they were willing to support it indicates that maybe there's a different view of just sort of science and wisdom, putting them together in the same sentence. And I was also heartened a couple months ago. I had a conversation with a neuroscientist named Andre Fenton, who's a very nuts and bolts memory researcher that studies molecules in the brain related to memory, basically. And we were talking, and he told me that one of the things that are on his list of things to do in the next decade, he just was hired at NYU, is to teach a course, what he called the Neuroscience of Ancient Wisdom. So people are just thinking about this in a way that they weren't before. And again, it's not to say that wisdom will ever be parsed. I don't think it actually will be parsed by science. But I think it's a way of addressing some of these qualities that might help us understand how to maximize our human performance. Now, I want to wrap up, as I do in the book, with a very fundamental question, which is there a place for wisdom in our modern world? Obviously, I think there is, but sometimes you wonder. First, I think the evidence is mounting, and we're no longer talking about single studies, but a growing body of scientific work that focused mental activity, whether it is meditation or a kind of mindful cognitive attention, can change the physiology and function of our brains. We see it in the compassion experiments. We see it in some of the recent fear extinction work that has just been coming out. And we see it in some of the neuroeconomic studies, which I discuss in the book. And just as an aside, last week I was invited to watch an experiment that was being done at NYU, where they're working on erasing fear from people. And it's a fear that's scientifically created for the purposes of the experiment. But by understanding the process of how memories are consolidated, they realize that you have to remember your fear every time you recall it. And if the circumstances are different when you recall it, you reconsolidate the memory in a different way. And there's already been a paper that was published in Nature, I think it's at the beginning of the year, actually, in January, that was a behavioral component of this. And now they're going back in the lab and looking through MRI studies to see if they can see anything going on in the brain when they're actually extinguishing a fearful memory that has been created. But the idea that by knowing the process of memory well enough mechanistically that if you intervene at a certain point, you can actually reverse or erase a fearful memory is a really interesting example of where this kind of work can lead. the big message from neuroscience in the past decade or so, and this is apropos of that, is that the brain is plastic, that is changeable. We can train the brain and develop cognitive strategies to keep emotion on an even par, delay gratification if that's what we need to do, and problem solve in a creative way. So I think the notion that our brain, we always talk about as being hardwired, but in fact that wiring can actually be tuned by experience, by practice, by exertion, by mental exercise, as it were. I think it's really early in this whole story, but I think it's an area that's going to expand and be really interesting over the next 20, 30, 40 years. As I just said, we're at the very beginning of the story, not the end, but I think we can see a path suggesting that certain cognitive exercises and mental exertions can enhance the possibility of wisdom or wise behavior, that perhaps we can influence our own behavior in a way that can allow us, again, to maximize our potential for this. Second, perhaps my happiest discovery in the research on this book is that I tripped over a truism that's been kind of true for 2,500 years when philosophers wrote about wisdom all the time, and we don't all that often. We've kind of lost sight of it in recent times. Thinking about wisdom makes us, if not wise, at least more deliberate and attentive to the choices that we make in life, and indeed the kind of life we choose to lead, or at least try to lead. I was grateful for this opportunity, and if those of you who happen to have a chance to read the book, I hope you experience the same thing that I did, that just by reading about wisdom, it really forces you to think about things in a way that maybe you don't normally take the time to think about, and I found it enormously helpful and useful. Thinking about wisdom forces us to interrogate ourselves about what's truly important in our lives. It slows down the clock of decision-making so that we can so that we consider multiple options. It focuses our attention so that we have a chance to ignore the multiple splendid distractions that mark modern life. And it forces us to confront and perhaps overcome the purely selfish gratifications that motivate so much human behavior. It nudges us to act in ways that benefit the greater social good, not just our own well-being. And third, this kind of armchair, amateur mindfulness, if you will, doesn't occur in a bubble. It has implications for our families, our domestic relationships, for our work lives, for our educational philosophy, for our politics. I think Erikson and the psychologists did a great service for neuroscientists by asking some very good questions about wisdom and attempting to define it. And I think neuroscience is now positioned to provide some very exciting answers, if not about wisdom per se, certainly about the cognitive and emotional qualities that have long been associated with wisdom. And as James Beeren, one of the pioneers in the whole field, told me long ago, we could all use more wisdom. So I think it's something worth thinking about. We should. Wisdom is still out there, and I think we would do well to invite it back into our lives. And I think that process begins when we stop whatever we're doing long enough to start thinking about it. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. Okay, thanks.
Steve will take some questions. We'd be grateful, and I see that Schieffer is getting a cup of water for Steve.
Thank
Great.
you.
Okay. Without even me asking. That's the great thing about working at the Hastings Center. John Schieffer, come on.
Great talk, Steve.
Oh, John, you always say that.
I really need it. So can you give an example? I have two questions, actually.
Thanks.
So the first one is whether or not there is a very specific technique or refinement old meditation techniques, spiritual practices that comes out of the neuroscience. And so that could be something fairly simple and conventional. But then the second question is a little more sci-fi. Do you think that this kind of research could eventually lead to, I don't know, technologies for inducing spiritual states and possibly even wisdom? So we don't have to meditate for 10,000 hours like this guy Ricardo.
You learn when you talk about technology to never say never. I think that that day, if it exists, is a long way off. Having said that, let me talk about a different experiment that's not actually related to compassion, but it speaks to the point you're talking about. There was a really interesting experiment done on altruism, and it's based on game theory. There's a thing called the ultimatum game, which some of you may be familiar with, and it basically has two players. One person is given $100, and then he is asked to decide a sum that he will give to the second player. And he can keep all of it if he wants to, or he can give a tiny amount. And the only point being that if the other second player refuses the offer, feels that it's insultingly low, then nobody gets any money. So there's an incentive for the first person to at least give some amount of money that will satisfy the second person and feel that he hasn't been slighted or she hasn't been slighted. And they've done studies on this, and it boils down to roughly, if you get $20 out of $100, you don't feel slighted, then you'll accept it's not considered insulting, and you'll accept it, and then both people accept this is the way it's traditionally worked. So what they did in this experiment is that they deliberately had the guy with the money make an insultingly low offer to the second person. And as they were doing this, they used a transcranial magnetic device that kind of was focused on a very particular part of his brain that's involved in the process of. They'd done prior experiments in this, so they knew the part of the brain that viewed the offer as insultingly low, and then the part of the brain that then acts on this insult to refuse the offer. So they were blocking the part that the action part of the brain after the insult has been received, so that they knew that the person perceived that the offer was insultingly low, but didn't turn down the offer the way they normally would have done, because the brain was being manipulated by this transient magnetic force field that's sort of outside the brain. Now, I'm not saying that that's around, this kind of thing is around the corner, but I also know that I think DARPA has been very heavily involved in research, supporting research on this kind of stuff. It would not surprise me that there are some technologies that are in development that are specifically designed to intercept or block specific parts of the brain, which I don't think we understand well enough to block them anyway, but that has never stopped people from trying to block it nonetheless. So if that's possible, it's at least conceivable that the reverse might be true, that if you could block something, you might also be able to enhance or energize or activate in some way, even externally by a mechanical device, a certain part of the brain. It is science fiction, and I'm not suggesting this is anything that's in the near future, or possibly even in our lifetimes. But again, technology, it's interesting about technology, it's always in advance of knowing how to use it well. I mean, the technology is refined and perfected. Tom and I were talking about this in connection with genetics. The technology of genomics and sequencing and all that stuff has just advanced tremendously, and it can be done really quickly and cheaply and all this stuff, and nobody knows what it means. They can't understand in fact, they understand less about what genetics means now than they probably did 10 years ago because of all the information. But the technology precedes the understanding. So I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but I just... Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, listening to you speak, it was great. By the way, it's like I don't think myself as wise, and I sort of hesitated coming. I was not up to it, but maybe think of two people I read last year, Matt Ridley and Daniel Gilbert, and I was just wondering how this research sort of spoke to theirs, if you had any correlation.
Which Matt Ridley were you referring to?
The Virtue book.
Oh, okay.
Just the Gilbert, I mean, especially in light of what you just said about this.
Yeah, well, I think Ridley talks about the history of altruism and sort of as a biological idea, which is a really interesting one historically. I talk about it very little bit in this book, but it's been talked about in other places a great deal more, how how Charles Darwin was terrified by social insects and the examples of bees in particular, because he thought the idea of a organism sacrificing itself for the benefit of the hive, which is what bees do, completely contradicted his idea of natural selection. And he wrote about it, how terrified he was that bees would kind of sink the whole idea of natural selection. So altruism as an idea has been critically important, certainly since the mid-19th century, and the biology has just gotten much more interesting in the last 20 years. So that's sort of the Ridley component. The Dan Gilbert stuff, it's sort of glancingly, it has a lot to do with decision-making and gratification in a certain sense, because this notion of happiness and what makes us happy is theoretically drives a lot of decisions. And so it's very, it's certainly related to the idea of value, but I don't think there's a one-to-one correspondence between happiness and value in terms of, the brain basically makes decisions on the basis of what will give what's valued the most, what outcome is valued the most, and happiness often is that value. But then when you have to begin to weigh instant happiness or immediate happiness versus delayed gratification happiness, this valuation process gets very interesting. And again, I talk about this in some detail actually in the book. There's been a ton of decision-making science and sort of how the brain makes decisions and choices, and all of it is about the algorithm of how you reach the decision. Very little of it so far, and probably because it's so hard that they're not ready to tackle it, is upstream of that process. How do you attach value to things? How do you decide that working 2 jobs now, just your child can go to college, in 20 years is the decision that will make you happiest? And how does the brain reach that decision-making process, or how does the brain know that you'll be happy in 20 years with that decision? And I think the wise answer to that is the brain doesn't know, and there's no guarantees anyway. And so you have to go with your best instinct under the circumstances. And the thing about wisdom, one of the things, let me just conclude with your answer with just a quick observation that the Berlin psychologists, it was called the Berlin wisdom paradigm. One of the points they made is that what distinguishes intelligence from wisdom is that if you want to quantify intelligence, you give somebody a test and they're the right answers to the questions, and on the basis of how people answer those questions, they're considered smart or not smart. And so intelligence is kind of quantified that way. In wisdom, there are no right answers because the context is constantly changing. So you can't quantify it in the same way, which makes it on the one hand fuzzier, but on the other hand probably more elevated as a kind of skill of knowing which is the right answer in the right context. Yeah.
Can you be wise and non-intelligent, just based on what you're saying? Just your opinion?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that's come up in a lot of conversations that's really interesting is in the sort of history of wisdom, there are a lot of kind of public figures who are associated with wisdom or are accorded are considered wise figures, like Confucius and the Buddha and Jesus Christ and Abraham Lincoln and Solomon, all these sort of historical figures. But there's a whole other dimension to wisdom that's not public. It doesn't kind of transpire on a public stage. It doesn't leave a paper trail. It's not an agent of history. It's a much more kind of domestic, quiet, behind-the-scenes sort of exercise of wisdom. And Vivian Clayton, who was one of the first researchers to address wisdom psychologically, said the 2 most important people in her life were her father, who she thought was very smart and assessed situations very carefully, knew when decisions needed to be done quickly, or you could deliberate on them, and that was one of her definitions of wisdom. But the other one was her grandmother, who she did not think was particularly intelligent, but nonetheless had a sense of contentment, of what would bring contentment both in a domestic setting and what kind of, how you lived one's life and how you arranged or managed a family in that setting brought contentment and happiness, and that was wise as well. So to answer your question, I think in these different dimensions that there are elements of both these things at play. And I should say, it's not that people are not smart. I think there's a degree of emotional intelligence, if you will, that's a big component of this. And Clayton deserves a lot of credit for identifying wisdom as having kind of three legs, one of which was cognitive, which you could think of as intelligence or intellectual, one of which was emotional, and just having that kind of emotional knowledge and experience, and another was reflective, which is to take the time to think about it and put those things together.
In order to preserve time for the reception, this is great. Let's take one more question. Would you like to?
You mentioned the research by the Wisconsin group on the meditation.
Mm-hmm.
How it increased the amplitude of the gamma waves in the EEG. I can imagine taking that gamma wave and showing it to the person, sort of like a biofeedback, and teaching, by showing them the waves, teaching them how to achieve that state of meditation faster than spending 10,000 hours.
Right.
Teaching them more quickly. I was wondering if that sort of approach, in your research, you came across any group that took that sort of approach to teaching wisdom.
Well, the reason they're going to Wisconsin is that the Dalai Lama is really interested in neuroscience, and he's actually very interested in precisely these questions, how this works. And if we understand this better, what can facilitate better meditation or allowing more people to meditate in this way. So he's been very open, and I read a fair amount of just sort of his view of the science of this, and he's reasonably. It's interesting because there's parts of what the Dalai Lama says, which really runs up against a wall of science and beyond which people are not going to agree. But he's very curious about the workings of the brain, how this might work, and I think part of that is possibly to empower or facilitate greater use of it. And I should say that the compassion stuff, Richie Davidson, I think, was pretty much of a loner doing this stuff maybe 10 years ago. Tony Damasio now is doing it, and maybe a name that some people recognize because he's done a lot of brain research. James Gross, who's a big emotion regulation researcher at Stanford, is now doing compassion research. It's really, a lot of people are starting to look at it as an interesting thing to look at. So there's going to be a lot coming out about it, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years.
Stay, please. So if wisdom, as Steve said earlier, is knowing what is important, then what do you say about a writer whose prose is so gracious and illuminating and focuses so unfailingly on what in fact is humanly important? And what I say is we're lucky to have Steve Hall here tonight, and there are 2 ways to get to ask him a question. One is to go while he's signing books. You'd be guaranteed FaceTime there, or to look for him out on the porch during the reception. And with that, let's thank Steve.
Thank you very much.